Watching Metropol Debrief, and tonight on the show we are discussing gender equality in Kenya. Is there gender equality in the first place, and how can we ensure economic development through achieving gender equality in the country? My guest, Janet Mbugua, thank you very much for making time.
Yeah, thank you.
And your resume is just, we cannot begin and finish. Media personality, project lead Better for Kenya,
That's right.
and very passionate about achieving gender equality in the country. However, that speaks to our topic of conversation today. When we talk about gender equality in Kenya, where do you think we are at currently? Is there gender equality in the country in the first place?
You know, first of all, thank you for having me. Is there gender equality? We've made strides, but the gaps are alarming. And I think the problem is understanding gender equality. It becomes a very polarizing conversation because it looks like it's men versus women. When gender equality really means every life matters. Everyone matters. I shouldn't be discriminated against based on my gender or my abilities or disabilities. And so the moment we begin to shift that notion that it's men versus women, we then begin to break down why it's important. Is there gender equality? There are certain sectors that have made strides here and there. But I mean, look at the numbers you just read, Ondira. I mean, you can see the gaps are still massive in terms of salary, in terms of women leaders. And, you know, we heard Farida's soundbite saying it shows when you have women in a docket in certain places, the deliverables reflect, right? So I feel like the fact that we're even having this conversation shows that we're making strides to talk about it. It's now a global topic. Countries are trying to move the gender equality narrative forward. They're trying to push it in the workplace, in the home. So because of that, I feel like, okay, it's a great time. But when you really think about what's happening on the ground, that's where the gaps begin to show. That we don't realize that when there's two people bringing income in the home, it's better for everyone, for the community, for the country. We need to understand that without gender equality, we can't move forward. And there's 130 years left to close the gender equality gap, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa, which is really disappointing to think about.
And speaking of strides that our countries are making, we were just talking about New Zealand before we came on air. I went through Rwanda, Namibia, South Africa, Bolivia, and Kenya. We tried in 2010 when we promulgated the new constitution. There's a 2/3 gender rule that is supposed to be passed. 8 years later, nothing has changed. The High Court came in and tried to intervene. We've seen women leaders came into parliament with white scarves, nothing. From where you stand, why can't we afford to procrastinate the 2/3 gender bill anymore?
And you know what it is again? You know, when people hear the 2/3 gender rule, and this is my assumption, I always start from what do people understand? They almost see it as this is just a ticket to have women, whether or not they're good at what they do. But the 2/3 gender rule is such that just by the fact that we're men and women, we are naturally, sort of like reciprocate, or rather look at issues differently through a different lens. 2/3 gender rule literally means we need to have women and men at a certain level together in numbers to be able to govern the country in a way that we look at things through a different lens and it's better for everyone. I don't know if I'm making sense. As opposed to looking at it like, oh, you're just giving out tickets because it's women. No. If the 2/3 gender rule worked in reverse and there was more women in parliament, we would still need a 2/3 gender rule to have an equal number of men. You know what I mean? So people need to begin to understand and unpack the meaning behind these things in order for us to have a conversation that moves us forward.
And how do we decolonize our mindset to get there?
I like that question. I really think, look, we're smart people, right? I honestly think Kenyans are some of the smartest people around. We need to stop having polarizing conversations. It gets so heated, divisive, without somebody saying, let's try and unpack this issue. And so even when you talk about gender equality online, immediately it's all these feminists, all these toxic feminists. But I'm like, you know, you can't afford to say that without understanding the spine of what we're trying to say, which is every life matters. We can't afford to say, you just want to give women 2/3 so that they're there. No. 2/3 matters because it works for both genders. Like I just said, if the flip side was that it was more men, we would need a 2/3 so that, if it was more women, we need a 2/3 so that there's more men. So how do we decolonize? We need to sit down, unpack, have conversations that are fruitful, that are productive, without it being polarizing. I feel like a lot of the time we always rush to have polarizing conversations because it's the sexy thing to do, because it's hot to drop a tweet that trends and goes viral, without saying, let's have more of these sessions. Let's sit down and have a safe space to say, tell me where you're coming from. I want to understand where you're coming from, and I want to see where we can meet each other halfway, and not, oh, you're a woman, so of course you're going to talk about gender equality, whatever, stay in your lane. I think that's what we need to start doing. I'm all about healthy conversations, but you find that people they'll push back based on what they assume. Yeah.
And speaking of conversation, there has been conversation going on about, one, the kind of privileges, so to say, that we can extend to women. And when I was going through the numbers, I said, only 1 out of every 5 international businesses is owned by women. 5% of men are in business and entrepreneurship, only 3% of women. And there are factors that keep holding women back. It's interesting that we have Farida Karane, a woman, as the Cabinet Secretary for the Ministry of Land. But land continues to be one of the key factors that is holding women back from getting access to credit.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is, we have great laws. I think Kenya is one of those countries that has fantastic things on paper. But when it comes to implementation, there's always a bottleneck. In the instance, if we're going to talk about land, for example, the law actually doesn't discriminate against women, right? But the cultural nuances do. So you find that, yes, you own a piece of land, but when it comes to contesting it for whatever reason, you'll still be linked to a man, right?
Yes.
Even the judiciary, sometimes there's a cultural nuance, even in the judiciary. So until the people effecting the law begin to do away with those nuances, we will still be held back. We will still be the person who is linked to so-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. And you can't stand on your own and own land or fight for land because you are linked to Mr. So-and-so. It's culturally. Culturally, you are a woman who belongs to a man, whether it's your father or your husband. And so I think that's one of the biggest bottlenecks, is the cultural nuances. We do have laws that allow it. We do. And yet we get to a certain place and you're held back. So again, I like to use New Zealand as an example. Rwanda is also a great example. But in the case of New Zealand, you know, whatever the law says, it's effected on the ground. So you cannot fight with the law. You can't try and tweak it or push it in a way that suits you. Whatever the law says goes. In Kenya, unfortunately, in many ways you can. Because if you have somebody sitting there in a bench and he feels like this isn't something that I want to fight for, or I feel like this is going against my culture, it's compromised.
Yeah.
And so I feel like those are some of the issues we need to talk about. We need a cultural audit in this country, because culture plays a very big role in a lot of the things that hold women back from progressing. Yeah.
Interesting conversation. We would like to take a short breather as we go through some of these things, as some of the things that you're saying sink into the brains of the viewers. We need to do a cultural audit, think through that. But before we go on that breather, this is what will be coming up on the other side of the break with Metropol Debrief.